There's a specific kind of silence that settles in long before anyone actually says goodbye. It doesn't announce itself with drama or confrontation. It builds slowly, in the space between phone calls that don't happen, in holidays where you rehearse excuses for why you can't attend, in moments when you see their name on your screen and your entire body tenses before you've even read the message. Maybe you know someone living in this silence. Maybe it's you. That quiet erosion of connection that looks like drifting from the outside but feels like survival from the inside. Most people think cutting off family is an impulsive decision, something dramatic, something fueled by anger or resentment, something that happens in the heat of the moment after one terrible argument. But psychology tells a very different story. For most people who reach this point, the decision isn't loud, it's heavy, it's slow. And it's usually the last step after every other option has already failed, after every attempt at communication has been met with dismissal, after every hope for change has quietly died. The cutting off doesn't happen in a moment. It happens over years, in small accumulations of hurt that pile up so gradually, you don't notice the weight until you can barely stand under it anymore. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. People don't cut off family because they are weak or selfish or incapable of forgiveness. They do it because they stayed strong for too long. They stayed quiet when they should have spoken. They stayed polite when they should have been honest. They stayed hopeful when the evidence kept showing them that hope was just keeping them tethered to something that was slowly destroying their sense of self. They stayed loyal to people who kept showing them in small but consistent ways that their emotional needs were never going to be met, that their feelings were never going to be validated, that their version of events was never going to be believed. And what's fascinating is that the brain does not interpret emotional neglect as something abstract or philosophical. It processes it as a threat. Not a dramatic threat, not an obvious one like physical danger, but a slow erosion of safety that happens so gradually you don't realize you've been living in survival mode until the moment you finally step out of it. The human nervous system is designed to seek connection, especially with family, especially with the people who were supposed to keep us safe when we were small and helpless. But it is also designed to protect. And when connection repeatedly becomes a source of confusion, anxiety, self-doubt, or pain, the brain starts doing something very specific. It begins to associate familiarity with danger. This is why people who cut off family often say something that sounds confusing to outsiders, something that doesn't make sense to people who've never experienced this particular kind of relationship. I felt calmer when I stopped talking to them, not happier, not relieved in a celebratory way, not vindicated or triumphant. Calmer. That calm is not cruelty. It is regulation. It's the nervous system finally being allowed to rest after years of bracing for impact, years of walking on eggshells, years of never knowing which version of the person you're going to get when you call or visit or show up to a family gathering. Psychologists describe this as a form of boundary-driven survival, not rejection. The brain isn't trying to punish anyone. It's trying to restore balance. It's trying to create an environment where the person can finally hear their own thoughts without someone else's voice immediately contradicting them, dismissing them, or reframing their experience until they can't trust their own perception anymore. And here's where the misunderstanding deepens, where the judgment from outsiders becomes most intense. Family bonds are supposed to be unconditional, right? That's what we're taught. That's what culture tells us. That blood is thicker than water. That family is forever. That you forgive and forget and keep showing up no matter what, because that's what family means. But healthy psychology does not mean unlimited tolerance. There is a difference between forgiveness and continued exposure. One allows healing. The other can quietly reopen the same emotional injury over and over again until there's nothing left but scar tissue and exhaustion. Many people who cut off family don't actually want distance. That's not the goal. That's not what they're hoping for when they make the decision. They want safety without conditions. They want conversations that don't require shrinking themselves down to fit someone else's comfort level. They want relationships where love isn't tied to obedience, where acceptance isn't conditional on agreeing with everything, where being yourself doesn't result in criticism disguised as concern. They want space where their identity isn't treated like a flaw that needs correcting, where their choices aren't constantly questioned, where their boundaries aren't seen as disrespect. And when those needs are repeatedly dismissed, when they're told they're too sensitive or they're overreacting or they're remembering things wrong, something shifts internally. At first, the mind tries compromise. Maybe if I just explain it differently. Maybe if I just adjust my expectations. Maybe if I just accept that this is how they are. Then it tries explanation. Sitting down and trying to articulate exactly what's hurting, exactly what needs to change. Then it tries silence, pulling back, creating space, hoping the distance will reset something. And finally, when none of that works, it chooses absence. What's rarely discussed is how painful that absence actually is, because cutting off family doesn't erase attachment, it suspends it. The emotional bond doesn't vanish just because you stop answering phone calls or attending holidays. It goes underground. It stays in your nervous system, in your memories, in the reflexes you developed to navigate those relationships. This is why people who cut off family still think about them on birthdays, still feel a quiet ache during holidays when everyone else is posting photos of family gatherings. Still wonder, late at night, if things could ever be different, if there's some combination of words they haven't tried yet that would finally make the other person understand. If they didn't care, it wouldn't hurt. If they were truly cold or heartless, the separation would feel easy, but it doesn't. Psychologically, this is called ambiguous loss or unresolved attachment. The relationship ends structurally, but not emotionally, and that unresolved attachment often creates guilt, this heavy, persistent feeling that sits in your chest and whispers that you're doing something wrong. Not because the decision was wrong, but because humans are wired to believe that loyalty equals morality. From a young age, most of us are taught that family endurance is proof of character, that staying no matter the cost is virtuous, that walking away makes you selfish, ungrateful, damaged. So when someone leaves, even for self-preservation, even after years of trying everything else, their mind often asks a cruel question. What kind of person does this make me? What kind of person cuts off their own family? And that question carries so much weight because it's not just coming from inside. It's coming from culture, from strangers who don't know the full story, from other family members who are angry about the separation, from well-meaning people who say things like, "But they're your parents," or "Life is short," or "You'll regret this when they're gone." This is where the internal conflict becomes intense, because on one side there is peace, there is relief, there is finally being able to breathe without that constant tension in your shoulders. And on the other side there is shame, there is guilt, there is this feeling that you've failed at something fundamental, that you've broken some unspoken contract about what it means to be a good person. And the brain struggles to hold both. Studies on emotional boundary setting show that people who choose distance from family often experience an increase in emotional clarity, but also an increase in self-questioning. They replay conversations in their minds. They reanalyze tone and intention. They wonder if they were too sensitive, too rigid, too demanding. They imagine alternative versions of those interactions where they said something different, something better, something that would have finally made things work. But here's the psychological truth that doesn't get enough attention, that gets buried under all the cultural messaging about family loyalty. People who cut off family almost always tried to stay longer than they should have. They tolerated patterns that chipped away at their sense of self bit by bit. They accepted explanations that minimized their feelings. They waited for apologies that never arrived. They gave chance after chance after chance, hoping that this time would be different, that this conversation would finally land, that this boundary would finally be respected. And the final decision often comes not after one big explosive event, but after a realization. This pattern is not changing, no matter what I do, no matter how clearly I communicate, no matter how many boundaries I set. This fundamental dynamic is not going to shift. That realization is not dramatic. It's devastating, because it means grieving. Not just the relationship you had, but the one you hoped for. The one you kept trying to create. The one you imagined was possible if everyone would just try a little harder. And grief changes how the brain processes connection. Neuroscience shows that when grief remains unresolved, when you're mourning something that's still technically alive and available, the brain becomes hyper-aware of emotional risk. It learns to anticipate disappointment. It develops a kind of radar for the patterns that hurt you before. So distance becomes a form of prevention, not punishment. It's the brain saying, I can't keep getting hurt in the same way, and I can't change the other person. So the only variable I can control is my exposure. Another misunderstood aspect is this. People assume cutting off family means erasing the past, pretending it didn't happen, moving on as if those relationships never mattered. In reality, it often means remembering the past too clearly. It means recognizing patterns that once felt normal, but now feel harmful when seen through adult awareness. As children, we normalize what we are given. We don't have a reference point for what healthy looks like, so we assume our experience is universal, that everyone's family operates this way. As adults, we name what we experienced. We develop language for it. We compare our childhood to what we now understand about emotional health. And naming something changes everything. What was once just how they are becomes how it affected me. That shift is powerful and it is terrifying because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. Once you recognize the pattern, you can't go back to pretending it's not there. And that clarity forces a decision. Do I continue to participate in a dynamic that costs me my peace, my self-trust, my ability to feel safe in my own family? Or do I accept the pain of distance in exchange for emotional stability? Neither option feels good. One just hurts less over time. Here's something rarely acknowledged. People who cut off family are often deeply relational. They care intensely. They feel deeply, which is exactly why they reach a breaking point. Emotionally detached people don't wrestle with this choice for years. They don't agonize over whether they're doing the right thing. They don't lose sleep replaying conversations. Emotionally aware people do. The very sensitivity that makes someone compassionate, that makes them notice when something is off, that makes them attentive to relationship dynamics, also makes prolonged emotional harm unbearable. And that sensitivity doesn't turn off after the cutoff. It just redirects. Many people pour that care into friendships, chosen family, creative work, therapy, inner growth. Not because they replaced their biological family, not because they've moved on completely, but because the human need for connection never disappears. It adapts. From a psychological standpoint, this is called relational reorganization. The mind restructures where it feels safe attaching. And interestingly, people who go through this often develop stronger boundaries across all relationships. They become more intentional about who they let close, more selective about who gets access to their inner world, more aware of early warning signs that someone might not be emotionally safe, not colder, clearer. They don't build walls to keep everyone out. They build boundaries to protect what they've worked so hard to heal. But there is one part of this experience that almost no one prepares you for. The loneliness. Even when the decision is right, even when you know logically that staying would have destroyed you, it can feel isolating. Because society does not offer many scripts for this kind of grief. There are rituals for loss through death. There are casseroles and condolence cards and funeral services. There are words for breakups, for divorce, for friendships that end. But there is very little public language for grieving someone who is still alive, still reachable, still posting on social media, but no longer emotionally safe for you to be around. So people grieve quietly. They grieve in moments that catch them off guard. A familiar song that reminds them of childhood. A memory that surfaces unexpectedly. A phrase that sounds like home used to sound before home became complicated. And sometimes they wonder if distance means failure. If choosing yourself means you weren't strong enough, weren't forgiving enough, weren't patient enough. But psychology suggests something different. Sometimes distance is the most honest form of self-respect. Not every relationship can grow with you. Not every bond can survive awareness. And that doesn't make anyone a villain. It makes them human. People grow at different rates. They develop awareness at different speeds. They have different capacities for self-reflection, for accountability, for change. And sometimes those differences become too large to bridge. There is a myth that healing means reconciliation. That if you've really done the work, if you've really healed, you'll be able to go back and have a relationship with the people who hurt you. But healing often means integration, understanding what happened without making excuses for it, accepting what cannot be changed, learning how to carry both love and distance without letting either define your worth. The psychology of people who cut off their family is not about rejection, it's about resolution. The resolution to stop betraying oneself in the name of peace. The resolution to choose emotional safety over appearances. The resolution to live honestly even when honesty costs something. And perhaps the most important truth of all is this. Most people who walk this path never wanted to. They wanted connection. They wanted repair. They wanted understanding. Distance was not the goal. It was the consequence of clarity. And clarity, once gained, changes how a person moves through the world forever. Quieter, stronger, more rooted in themselves. Not perfect, but real.